So any lingering questions or anything anybody wanted to comment? Yes, Kay.
Are there any tribes or areas or whatever in the Western culture that were atheists, that didn't have some kind of a god to blame for everything? Or are atheists relatively new?
So it depends on who's defining atheist. Many traditional monotheistic religions will tell you that anybody who doesn't agree with them is an atheist, right? And so they will say that any indigenous religion is atheism because it doesn't believe in, especially if it's polytheistic, that is to say it doesn't have one big overarching God in charge of everything. But and so if what you're talking about is non-supernaturalism, I'm not sure that there is any culture, including us, because we still have things that we can't explain how they happen. And we say, oh, well, the electrons do it, or the viruses do it, or these things that we can't see but just believe are there, make things happen. Does that make us superstitious? Does it make us religious? And, I'm not sure that there's a bright line, I guess is what I'm saying, between ignorance and superstition and atheism and primitive religion.
I guess what I was thinking of was a culture where the community or the tribe did not have the superstitions that we call religion, where they lived. I've heard of, I think Margaret Mead found somebody in the South Pacific that did that once, but other than that, I don't know that I've ever heard of such a thing. And I was trying to think of where religion comes from. Why is there something human about, is there something about religion that humans need it? For some reason, we simply have to have an answer. And when we don't have one, we make one up.
Well, every culture has unfinished science. Okay, so if I say that I believe in black holes, even though I have obviously never personally experienced one, and I will accept the proposition that I could not experience one, or if I did experience one, I wouldn't survive. But I'm still willing to accept the proposition of the physicists that such things are there in the universe. Looked at from a certain perspective, you could call that religion, because I'm believing in the power of a thing that I can't see or testify to. So I think there are cultures that are a lot maybe, all right, here's maybe a distinction that would help. There are cultures that understand themselves to be participating in a religious narrative. God is doing a story that is unfolding over time that their people are part of, right? There are other cultures that understand themselves to be at the mercy of forces that they don't necessarily comprehend or control, but don't necessarily think that that's part of an overarching narrative structure, right? So the volcano could blow up at any time. And so we might talk about, how's the volcano feeling today? I mean, we might personify that. But if we don't say, well, the volcano blew up the last time a green guy married a blue girl, so we better not let that ever happen again, then you're getting into storytelling about that. which might put you in a different category of understanding. But I don't think there's any culture that doesn't personify and try to relate to the natural forces that they're surrounded by. Peggy, go ahead.
I was going to say, like, the way we see it in terms of like the earliest images and objects that people made. I mean, this is where you see the beginning, and where you got to go all the way back. And it seems like everywhere in the world, it started out the same way. It was a matter of, number one, living in a world where you had no control. It was a matter of having some control over the world you lived in. They didn't have for a very long time the concept of actual gods. I mean, that's not that primitive.
Right.
You don't have that for a long time, but you do have things like the earth as the early symbol of like fertility, and the idea of the female. I mean, that's the earliest, is sort of
The
mother
pregnant woman
goddess,
is sort
right,
of, yeah.
right.
Mhm.
And then you start seeing images and objects being used in ritual. That begins early. It's like, I don't know when it's going to rain, or if it's going to be a drought,
Right,
or whatever, but maybe if I do this
right.
and make this object, or draw this on the wall, or maybe if I act in a certain way, that will affect the world. So it's all
The
attempt
last time we
to
did this
have
dance, it rained.
exactly,
Yeah,
exactly. Maybe we'll have some control. And then it took a very, very long time before it made that switch over to actual gods with names. And of course, that begins with the natural elements as well. And then later they get personified, but it seems to have something to do with control, or wanting to
For
understand
sure.
why things happen and how can I influence that.
I guess I
And-
was kind of naive. I assumed that some of these tribes had no gods at all, and they all did, and it kind of shocked me. So
Mhm.
thank you.
Yeah. And some of that is just sort of the personification of those natural forces. Whether it's the ocean, or the the fertility of the soil, or whatever it is. So how elaborate does that have to be before you start calling it a god? If it originates as just knocking on the tree that you're about to cut down so that the tree spirit gets warning to leave, I mean, I guess I always see it as a continuum rather than a binary yes, no kind of. And I think human beings are forever attributing consciousness, because I have intention and I think and feel things. The next question is, do all these other people that I'm surrounded by have intention and think and feel things? And we generally tend to assume that they do, So what about the cat? Does the cat think and feel and intend things? I mean, perhaps not in the same way that I do, but I certainly think to some extent. What about the daffodils out in the front yard that are trying like heck to grow now that the sun is out? Do they think and feel and have intention? Well, what about the volcano that could blow up and kill us all? Does that think and feel and have intention? How do you differentiate those things? And just because we in our culture in our time have reached certain conclusions about where different natural phenomenon fall on that continuum of consciousness, doesn't mean we're any more right about that than any other historical period. So and in fact, I mean, there are people who would say, I'm one of them. I would say that the mosquito that I would like to obliterate does not think and feel and have intention in the same way that I do. And so it's okay to obliterate it in a way that is not okay to obliterate my cat, who I think does think and feel and have intention in a way similar to how I do, but not exactly how I do. So I think that's universal, right? Everybody does that. Or we couldn't have society. I guess if you're going to have culture, you have to have people who project the theory of mind on other people, right? Because otherwise all you have is a collection of sociopaths. And so once you have that, then I think you almost always have the attribution of that to things outside of human beings. Or at least it would be a unique culture, and I've never heard of one that had a theory of mind only for other human beings. That would be the thing that I would have to see in order to say they were really atheists. Yeah. Thank you for helping me think about that. That's a great question. Yes, Anna.
I was just thinking, about the top-down kind of God-centered religion versus, which is about control and really kind of human running of things, dominating things in a way, I guess, or something dominating something. But then you look at like a Native Americans, and there are many kinds. It's not all one thing, obviously, but one of their spiritual systems, which is more about cooperative living with the universe and the world that they understand. And it's like, it's a different attitude spiritually. It's not about us and then everything in relation to us. It's more like, it's not like we're the focus and then everything's related to our existence. It seems like it's more, we are only one part, and the river has a part and the mountain has a part. And it's about mutual respect between things. And that I don't get that feeling at all from the traditional top-down religion stuff that we know, if that makes any sense, what I'm saying.
Yeah, yes. And I do think certain narrative structures and certain cosmology, certain ways of understanding the nature and origin of the universe make you more likely to see it as a question of who's in control of what versus who's helping what. But I also think that any faith tradition, any religious view of any depth can be interpreted in a variety of different ways. So I'm absolutely confident that there were Native Americans, and we know that they made war on each other all the time and, competed for hunting grounds. I'm sure there were ones of them that were like, no, our God, said we were supposed to have this land and therefore you can't. And, our guy can beat up your guy. We just don't have the records of that. We don't have that perspective recorded, just as there have always been Jews and Christians who were, who saw, all people as children of God, equally deserving of, love and grace. And, but they didn't win out over time. So it's, it's partly what part of the history gets preserved and what part gets kind of falls by the wayside.
Well, Kendall, I have read that the Navajos and the Utes were very much that way. Their gods were against each other, and they were neighbors. And so
right.
They've always been
right. And they, there were probably holy people or whatever you wanted to call those spiritual people in each group that were saying, no, that's wrong. What the gods really want is for us to, act with justice and love mercy and walk humbly. And, I believe that those two impulses not only are present in every faith, but are present in every person. That each one of us has those energies within us, and that's why covenant is important, because it's what do we commit to? How do we choose between or among those impulses in terms of what we're going to give expression to? What do we choose as our guide to conduct that we're going to be that we're going to follow even when it feels counterintuitive, you know, even when it feels like I'd really like to go stomp those people, because I feel like I have a good reason to do that, but I've already committed myself to a life of nonviolence, so I'm not going to, you know, or you know, I really don't feel like stomping those people, but I've already committed myself to a life of as a warrior, and so that's my job. You know, that's kind of the end of the Bhagavad Gita, you know, that Krishna says, you know, go do the thing that you're born to do, that you've committed yourself to.
Survive.
Well, yes, yes, and what does that then require of you, or help your family survive, or whatever? Yeah, Mike.
Well, that's the reason I'm a Unitarian. I'm an outgrowth of Apollo 8 and 68. The whole first time we were able to view the Earth
Right.
from a distance, and
Right.
we're all on the same lifeboat. And even
Yeah.
if I don't like the blankety blank SOB at the other end of the lifeboat, I gotta
Right.
prevent the lifeboat from being destroyed. So I gotta get along with them, even
Right.
if I may really want to do bad things, you know,
Mhm,
be a
mhm.
warrior or
Mhm,
whatever.
mhm.
But
Yeah.
the ultimate is preserve the lifeboat.
Mhm.
I have something.
Yeah, Joyce.
Now, this is going to sound crazy, but I like to take myself back, daydream like 30,000 years ago.
Mhm.
And what would I have been like in my very,
Yeah.
very beginning?
Yeah.
And I think my brain would be developing, my emotions would be developing, and I would find love. I mean, I would care deeply for my offspring or whatever. And I think if something would happen to that offspring, I feel great sadness, and I want them to live on. And somehow I think maybe that's how it all started, and then it just developed more and more.
You mean you would want to imagine a universe in which they would continue somehow to exist?
Right.
Yeah, right. And sure, people
After
I
do.
mean, I
Right.
think people will be more afraid of losing someone they love
Right.
than dying themselves.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sure.
And it just grew out of that.
Mhm.
So I'm
Well, there certainly are cultures that have a far less developed vision of the afterlife, and cultures that have a much more sophisticated vision of the afterlife. That we see. And so you know, it depends on how elaborately do you want to envision what that looks like for them.
yeah.
Yeah, Al.
Well, wasn't that pretty much the appeal of Christianity, was the afterlife? Because Judaism didn't originally have an afterlife.
That's
came
right.
much later. So
Right.
that was
That's
what was appealing.
Right. That's right. And not just Christianity, but the whole I think there's the beginning of a theological move, which Islam is also part of the answer to. I mean, that was one of the appeals of Islam as well, was the idea that not only is there an afterlife, but it is essentially bound up with judgment. You know, that's what Islam gave people, is don't worry if someone seems to be getting away with something in this life, because they will be judged. And even Christianity didn't quite do that. Christianity said, well, oh, you know, if you become a new person in Jesus, none of that other stuff that you did will matter, which is great news for you, but not so much great news for the person that's really hoping that eventually you're going to get, you know, smacked for the bad thing that you did to them. And that's sort of the promise of Islam, is that, okay, you know, there will be justice in the afterlife, after people are through here. So yes, Kay.
There is that in the Black Christian church as well.
Mm,
That
mm.
was a huge part of, I think, Christianity's appeal to the slaves, was that you're screwed now, but you
You're
just,
right.
you know.
Right. Although I think it was for them, it was more the good things that are in store for people who are suffering here now. You know, there isn't as much focus as you might think was justified on the ways in which the people who have it good now are going to be suffering.
You're right.
But-
I put that in because I wanted it in.
right, that's right. And that makes me wonder whether, and this is really going down a rabbit hole, but whether that vision of people who've done you wrong suffering is in itself a manifestation of privilege. That it's the part of my entitlement in the world is to see the people who do wrong to me get punished, right? And if you don't think of yourself as particularly entitled, then the focus is more on, could I just not have to suffer, please? Could I just have enough food and, nobody pursuing me or making me do things that I don't want to do. It's so when you think about what the vision is of what the afterlife might be for the righteous. Well, all right, you never know where theology is going to raise its head, right? But I want to do a little more history so that we can talk about how Christianity responded to the challenge of the emergence of Islam. And so in order to sort of understand that, we need to review a little bit. So, and we need to bring another player on stage, and that player is the kingdom of Persia, what's often called the Sassanid Empire, which is and this is where the map is going to be helpful, actually. So if you see the Mediterranean, okay, and then you have Italy way to the west and north, and that Rome is actually on this map. So you can see where Rome is there. And just keep in mind how far away that city is from the action that we're going to be talking about for the next little while. It's kind of way over there. And then if you come down around the Mediterranean to Palestine, everybody see Palestine, and you should be able to pick out Jerusalem there. All right. So that's where Jerusalem is, and all the Jewish stuff is happening. And then if you come down around a little more to the west from Jerusalem is Alexandria, right? And that's sort of the southwesternmost part of where Christianity is going to. Yes, Anna.
The map's key is cut off. What does the blue and the orange indicate on the map's key at the top right?
Oh, you didn't get, so the Byzantine Empire is sort of labeled there, and the Sassanid Empire is labeled in the, where it says Persia.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, so we know the difference between the Byzantine Empire and the Western European Roman Catholic religious area, right? That's a division that we've already come to understand, right? When the capital moves to Constantinople, and you can pick out Constantinople right there on the Black Sea, and you can see how far away it is from Rome. And then if you come almost, well, a little angle down from Constantinople, you'll see Antioch there. And Constantinople's kind of there on that really easily defensible kind of connection point between what's called Asia Minor there and the Western European area. So those two are in conflict about the meaning of Christianity, right? They're both Christian, but now they're trying to figure out who's in charge of Christianity. And the Bishop of Rome is one candidate, okay, and then the Patriarch or the Bishop of Constantinople is another candidate. And the Constantinople folks have the other four patriarchates, the other three, so there's four total, of Jerusalem, Antioch, and Alexandria. So that's kind of a cohort that's supporting Constantinople as the source of Christian authority, right? Meanwhile, away over to the east, you have the Persian Empire. And the Persian Empire doesn't care about Christianity. They are Zoroastrian, and particularly at this moment, they are pretty thoroughly Zoroastrian. And so they don't consider the conflicts that are going on in Christianity anything that they have to take responsibility for. However, they would constantly like to be expanding their empire. This Persian Empire has been going on since, back in the Old Testament, right? We dealt with them. So they would like to infiltrate the Byzantine Empire, right? They would like to push their territory more and more to the west, right there a little to the left of the Caspian Sea. You kind of see the border, right, between those two groups. So there's constant military pressure and engagement between those two groups. And of course, the Byzantine Empire, for their part, would love to take over more of the Sassanid Empire, more of the Persian territory. So it's not like there's just one aggressor. They're both out for what they can get. Now, if you notice, the Byzantine Empire kind of swoops down to the south there and takes in that coastal edge along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, right down through Palestine. That's all Byzantine initially. And then the Persian Empire kind of has that little curve shape out of the Arabian Peninsula that they control, right? Everybody see that? That blank space in there in between those two where it says Arabs, that's what we're talking about, right? That's where Islam emerges. That's where Muhammad is the guy. And all the way down towards the bottom of the map, you can see Mecca. And remember, Medina is about 200 miles north of that. And if you went the one flaw in this map is it doesn't come all the way down to the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula where it sticks into the ocean. There will be a period of time where at the sort of picture the bottom off the bottom of the map there, the Persian Empire will control what is now Yemen, what is now the area right at the bottom on the shore of the southern edge of the Arabian Peninsula. And they control that. Why? Because it's an important port for trading, right? So they want access to that shipping for their trading empire. And that will become geopolitically significant, that the Persian Empire controls that little tip down at the bottom. But for the majority of that peninsula, it's all desert, right? It's very it's not fertile. It's not suitable for agriculture. Even herding is difficult. So you have along the Red Sea and along the western coast there, you have a trade route. But most of it's just not very populated at all. So neither the Byzantines nor the Sassanids are particularly worried about Arabia, right? It's just not relevant. Nobody wants it. Nobody lives there as far as they're concerned. It's just not a factor in what they're thinking about to start out with.
Kendall, what year are we talking?
Just at the time that Islam is beginning to rise. So the middle of the 7th century, Muhammad dies in 632. And at that point, things start to blow up as the, well, we'll talk about that in a minute, but there's, it's historically very convenient that Muhammad dies in 632, and the defeat of the Moorish invasion from Spain happens in France at Tours in 733. So there's basically a convenient century during which Islam suffers almost no defeats, does almost nothing but expand during that time. And then once they get stopped in coming into Europe from the West, then things start to stabilize, and people have to cope with a new status quo of who controls what in that area. Right before that, it's kind of all in flux because the Muslim armies are just trouncing everybody everywhere they go. So just we're in that 100 years. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Great. Okay. So at this point, the Western Christians, the Roman Christians, the ones that are in Europe, have no dog in the fight between the Byzantine Empire and the Sassanid Empire, right? Rome does not really care that much where that shift is happening between the Byzantines and the Persians, because the Persians are not threatening them, right? The Persians would have to get through the Byzantines in order to be a problem for the Romans. And by the same token, what we've talked about before now, if you look up in the Northwest, you see the Visigoths, the Frankish kingdoms. Remember, we talked about the Lombards invading Italy. The Byzantines don't care about that because Rome is their buffer. And so, whereas the Roman Catholic Christians, the Bishop of Rome, is all into what can they do to evangelize those people? What can they do to make Christians out of the Lombards and get the Spanish Visigoths on board and all that? That's where they're trying to expand their territory. It's sort of the other direction. So that's why they're not that interested in what the Byzantines are doing with the Persians, even though one of the things that irritates the Byzantines about the Romans is that they won't come help. You know, they're supposed to be fellow Christians, right? They should be invested in this thing where they're trying to expand the Christian territory, and they don't want to send soldiers. They don't want to help out because it's not their problem. It's not their fight, right? That makes sense. Okay. So the Western Catholics don't care about Persia because they're buffered from it. The Eastern Orthodox don't care about the Northern pagans because they're buffered from it. Nobody thinks that there's anything to worry about from the south, from the Arabian Peninsula. That's not a factor as far as they're concerned. So last time we talked about the wars that broke out almost immediately after the death of Muhammad, because the tribal groups that live in Arabia understand themselves to give fealty, to give service and loyalty on a personal basis to other tribal groups or military interests as a kind of limited thing. So if my tribe has a better leader and a stronger military presence at the moment than yours, then rather than us being constantly in conflict and me losing all the time, I would be better off to align myself with you, to make an alliance, to say, okay, my tribe will go along with your tribe because you are stronger at the moment. And so you might give me some gifts to help out my tribe, and we will come and help you fight the next time somebody attacks you, or the next time you think you're going to go take some new territory or whatever. And that alliance, that relationship will last as long as the leader of my tribe and the leader of your tribe continue to be in alliance with each other. So part of what happened with the initial expansion of Islam is that Muhammad, having proved by his conquest of Medina and then his reconquest of Mecca, that he was a strong, competent military leader with significant troops, attracted alliance from a number of the surrounding tribes. And what he said to them was, okay, fine, you want to be in alliance, you accept Allah, you accept Islam. And they're like, okay, whatever. Because none of them understood that to be anything that didn't end with the death of Muhammad, right? That's the way this always works. We submit to your tribe, whatever conditions you want to set. Yeah, okay, we worship your guy, whatever. But that's all up for grabs until we see what the next leader is going to be like, right? And what Muhammad understood, and what those who got what he thought Islam was about were like, no. Once you accept Allah, once you accept Islam, that is a religious commitment. That has nothing to do with the politics of the area. So when Muhammad died, the first thing that happened was everybody else said, okay, now what? That was fun, that's over. Now what are we going to do? And so the successors of Muhammad, if they were going to hold this thing together, had to go out and demonstrate to all of those tribes and all of the ones who might not have come into alliance first time around, that we are still the power in the area. We are still the ones who can hold together the most powerful coalition. And so you should continue in your loyalty. You should continue with the submission that you have already ostensibly made. And if you think you're not going to, guess what? We are going to show up with our army, and yes, you will. And so that those first couple of caliphs, the first two leaders after Muhammad, had a job to do, which was to reconfirm all of the alliances that had been made during the time of Muhammad's life. And so that's what they're doing, is consolidating their power all throughout that Arabian Peninsula. Now, one of the things that both the Sassanids and the Byzantines found convenient was on their borders with Arabia, they also made alliances with the tribal groups that lived in those areas, right? And that one of the things that those groups were good at was moving around the desert. They knew how to do that. The Persians weren't as good at it, and the Byzantines certainly weren't as good at it. The Romans were never good at it. So they would contract basically with the local tribes to say, okay, we need you to do three things basically for us. One, we need you to defend us from your buddies. Okay, the other tribes that are out there that want to come in and raid and just see stuff from us, whether that's the flocks, or whether that's trade goods, whether that's caravans on their way to another trading post, whatever it is, we will pay you to watch out for us on our border, because you know these guys and you can help us out. Okay, so these tribes are going to say, all right, fine, for X%, or however we're going to work that out, we will defend you from our other gangs, just like us. Okay. The other thing that we want you to do, if we're forming this alliance, is we want you to let us know and defend us if there are troops from the other empire on the way. So if the Byzantines are sending an army against us, Persia, we want you, the tribes on our southern border, to keep an eye out for that. And if that happens, we want you to fight with us and help us defend ourselves. Because you know how this desert battle kind of thing works. And it wasn't all that common because neither of the empires, neither the big empires particularly liked desert warfare, right? It wasn't something they were good at. They didn't enjoy it. It wasn't noble in conception in the same way that a pitched battle between these two groups was. But you had to keep an eye out for it because someone could always sneak up on you. So and then the third thing is, if we need to go attack them because they stole something of ours or whatever, we want your help, you tribal people, because you know how to do this fighting in the desert. And so if we have to do that, we want you to help us out, right? So those three obligations of sort of border defense, and both groups did that. The Persians did that with the tribal people on their border, and the Byzantines did it with the tribal people on their border, right? Does that make sense? And so those groups, those tribal groups who were in those relationships with the major empires, also kind of out of necessity, were in a conglomerate alliance with each other. Okay, because if my tribe's been hired by the Persians and your tribe's been hired by the Persians, the one thing that's going to make the Persians really unhappy is us fighting among ourselves, right? And not being prepared to help them. So the result of that was that there were major tribal groups on both borders, on both the northwestern border and the northeastern border, that had been brought together by this process of alliance with the empires. And so one of the things that the Muslims had to do was to go confront those tribes and say, hey, you are Arabs first, right? Your first loyalty is to the tribal people like you, and we are here to represent a more powerful overall alliance among us Arabic people than has ever happened before. And that was an appealing message to those folks, because they were not treated with huge respect either by the Persians or by the Byzantines, right? They were sort of a necessity and a convenience, but they weren't highly respected. So the leaders of Islam had to go and sort of try and reconnect with their folks and who were allied with, all right, Kat, figure it out, who were allied with those major empires. And the way that I've finally got kind of a handle on this was to think about the tribal people in North America when the English and the French were still vying for control over the New World as they thought of it. And both of those groups, the English and the French, would often make alliances with the Native American tribes to get them to help them fight other Native American tribes and fight the other European power that they were in competition with. But those alliances were constantly shifting, and you never knew when a particular tribal group was going to decide that actually the French are making us a better offer, or actually this general insulted us and his soldiers raped some of our women, and so we're going to go over to the other side. Or what, it was a very loosely structured kind of alliance. And the Native Americans also had alliances among themselves. So sometimes, you know, if you got one tribe to sign on, they would bring their buddies, their other tribes that they were already allied with, or you might inherit their hostilities. You know, it's okay. We made an alliance with you. That doesn't mean we were declaring war on these other guys. Well, yeah, it did, because we were already at war with them. So that I think it was sort of like that. If that image helps you kind of visualize what's going on there. And so the Muslims were able to kind of draw away the folks who had been signed on as supporters for the Persians and the Byzantines. And they were able to do that because it was politically and militarily, and in some cases economically expedient for those people. But they also began to tell the story of that as this is proof that Muhammad was in fact a prophet, and this is in fact what Allah wants, and that the growth of our empire is a demonstration that Islam is the true religion, right? And so whereas you had a bunch of different generals going out to a bunch of different tribal groups trying to reinforce their alliances and bring folks on board who maybe had been being subjects to the Persians or the Byzantines. It reminds me a little bit of the period in the Hebrew scriptures where, you know, the Hebrews are camped outside the promised land, right? And they're doing all these little raids into Canaan. And it's not a very organized process, right? It's some group hits one village or one town, and sometimes they're successful and sometimes they're not. But the folks who are writing the Old Testament, who are making scripture out of this, are telling a story about how this is all God's plan, right? They are making an overarching, coherent narrative about how this proves Yahweh's power. Then, folks, remember that from when we were talking 2 years ago? Yeah, okay, all right. Same thing is happening here. This is now proof that Allah has a plan, and we're all part of that. And all of these different military things that are happening are either proof that we did good, and this is what Allah wants us to do, or if we lost, why was that? Anybody, how do we explain it when we lose?
We didn't sacrifice the right things to the right people.
Right. We are not sufficiently righteous. You know, we're not sufficiently on board with what Allah is telling us to do. Right. So it's that same process of kind of assembling an empire out of scraps, dribs and drabs here and there, in part because of this narrative that this is what God has in plan for us. Now, just before the rise of Islam, in fact, during the early life of Muhammad, the Persians had actually reached out, and they'd made a quick grab for a period of about 30 or 40 years all along Mesopotamia, through Damascus and Jerusalem, all the way over to Alexandria. They'd had a really competent couple of generals, and they'd been able to seize that territory. Now, they didn't hold it very long. It's only a couple of decades that they were there, but it partly because it was at tremendous cost. I mean, it's kind of like if you think about Rome trying to control up in the British Isles, it almost never works because it's too far away. You can get there, but you can't hold on to it, especially if the local people don't want you in the first place. And in this case, they didn't, because this was the Sassanids, the Persians, taking over from the Byzantines. So they, the ordinary people of the land didn't necessarily want the Byzantines, but they certainly didn't want the Persians. So, they were sort of double cursed. So it didn't last very long, but it weakened the Persian army. It weakened their military forces. It cost them a lot of money, a lot of resources to do that. So then when it didn't work out, after Muhammad died, they were in a very vulnerable state. They were not as strong as they had been at periods in the past when they had been more able to withstand both the Christians and the raiding from the south. They also had a series of assassinations and military coups, if you will, and a very insecure succession for a number of decades. And so you're always vulnerable when people don't know who's in charge, who the actual king or so on is.
When you say they, you mean the Persians and
the Persians. Right, the Persians. So for a variety of reasons, they were weaker than normal at the time when Islam was kind of at its most expansive, is what I'm trying to, and plus they were still constantly under pressure from the Byzantine Christian forces. That never stopped, just because they were trying to do these other things. And so the Muslim forces were able to make a lot of headway into Persian territory, and they were able to hang on. And so, remember we talked last time about the initial policy of the Muslim armies was that they did not distribute land as booty to the soldiers. They did not come in and dispossess the native population, which made them less unpopular than a lot of other potential overlords, shall we say. And so, and they were also reasonably tolerant because Zoroastrianism is more or less a monotheistic faith. The Muslims were willing to interpret it as being a kind of proto-Islam, the same way they thought about Judaism and Christianity. Is that, oh, okay, you guys worship one God. Well, we just have to tell you some details about who that is, right? Because we have a recent message from him, but it's the same God. They kind of had that initial attitude, although it will not be maintained for as long as they maintained it toward Judaism and Christianity, because they are not people of the book. They're not one of the groups that Muhammad sort of specifically identified as being sibling faiths, if you will. But initially, they were tolerant of it. And so they were able to do this system that we talked about last time, where, yes, the Muslim generals and the Muslim overseers are in charge, but everybody else just kind of carry on. And, as long as you're willing to be a peasant dirt farmer, you can go worship Ahura Mazda and we're all good. Now, if you happen to want to become educated, if you happen to be ambitious, if you would like to rise in the world, either through government service or military service or trade, if you want to do any of those things that might actually change your condition in the world, well, guess what? It really helps if you're Muslim, if you want to do those things. Now, we're making arrangements with, the old trade families, and we're going to have these client relationships where we can figure out how to sort them out into the social categories that we, the Muslims who are running things, are familiar with. But really, wouldn't you rather be a Muslim? Wouldn't life be easier if you just did that? How committed are you to this Ahura Mazda guy? Really? And some people really were. And as the generations went on, some of them actually made self-sacrifices for their faith. They really refused to convert, even when they were really pressured to. But a lot of it was economic and social pressure that just created the conversions of the elites, right? So that they weren't after some ignorant farmer who just didn't see the point of all of this theology. They were happy to leave him alone. But if you wanted to be rich, if you wanted to be powerful, then the more of that you wanted, the more pressure there was to become Muslim. And once you were, then you certainly weren't going to go back, and your descendants weren't going to go back, because then they would lose all those advantages. So the conversion process was largely not physically violent. I mean, one could argue that the economics of it were violent at some level, but it wasn't convert or die kind of thing mostly. But it ended up being that the educated and powerful elites were, in fact, indigenous Muslims, not just the Muslims who had come from outside, but the ones who were from families that had been there all along. And in many areas, especially on the borders of both the Byzantine Empire, the Christian Byzantines, and the Persians, as long as you're still in Arabia, those Muslim invaders thought of themselves and were looked on by a lot of the common indigenous people as liberators. They were doing what Jesus's followers had hoped that Jesus would do with the Romans, right? Would just throw out the occupation forces, right? Because we're Arabs, right? All together, and we're, Arabia for the Arabs, right? I mean, it's kind of an ethnic thing, and we don't need these colonial powers, being all in our business and taking away the fruits of our labors in taxes that are going to Constantinople or going to Ctesiphon, to be spent by people who have no concern for us. And so there was a sense in which many people were happy to see them, and many people in the lower classes were open to Islam as the expression of an indigenous Arabian prophet. And that takes us over to the next page, because there was a sense, and I think Muhammad himself felt this, that the God, the big guy, whatever you wanted to call him, had sent a prophet to the Jews in Egypt. He sent Moses to the Jews to get them out of Egypt. And then he sent Jesus to the Jews in Jerusalem, to the nation of Israel. What? All right. Oh, okay, you're good. I was afraid you were saying you couldn't hear. And both of those were supposed to be messengers from God, but they were not Arab-speaking messengers. They weren't messengers to the land and the people of the Arabian Peninsula. And that there was a sense of, what am I, chopped liver? There was sort of a resentment about never having had our own prophet. And so Muhammad, I think, kind of saw himself as that, as finally God sending someone. It's like, yeah, well, if there's no one else, I guess it's me. That here we have our own prophet. And so for the indigenous Arabs who saw themselves as oppressed by the occupying powers of either Persia or the Byzantine Empire, Muhammad was good news. It's like, oh, finally, our own guy. Yeah, let's do his thing. We certainly don't need this religion from Rome, and we're not that impressed with the the Persian idea either. So this made more sense to them as being something that was really native to them and grew out of their own traditions rather than being imposed. It didn't feel imposed from outside, even though we can look at it and say, well, you know, how is having somebody impose their thing from Mecca any different? But it was different for them. Okay, so do all those sort of motivations make sense? Because I think that's what we have to have in mind in order to understand where this goes. Okay, I wanted you to just have an outline of these four caliphates because they kind of bring us almost to the modern era. And the first three bring us to the exact time of the Reformation. So we have the Rashidun, and we talked about that last time. Those are the first four leaders, the successors of Muhammad. Caliph literally means successor. The first four after Muhammad dies, which you remember the first three are all his fathers-in-law, right? And then the fourth is Ali, who is his nephew and ward, basically. Sort of like a Batman and Robin kind of thing. So Ali is Robin. And Ali really thought that he was the successor that Muhammad wanted. He was the appropriate successor. He was the blood successor. Remember, everyone else is only related to him by marriage, whereas Ali is not only his son-in-law, but also his second cousin or something like that. But anyway, he's related. He's also the grandchild of Muhammad's grandfather. I think that's right. Anyway, so those four are the ones who conduct these first 30 years roughly of consolidation and what should I say, growing ambition, you know, because what happened is they succeeded. You know, they went out, they got all of these tribal alliances set back up, and they started making inroads on the edges of the empires to the north. They succeeded in taking over the little colony on the south in Yemen, where the Persians had territory there. And so it's like, well, you know, does Allah want us to stop now? Apparently not, you know. So let's just keep going, especially given the vulnerability of the Persian Empire, because there was not an effective opposition nearly as much as there was with the Byzantines. So, but as we know, for sure, Umar, Uthman, and Ali, the last three, were all for sure assassinated. And so it was not a peaceful transition. It was not a secure succession at all. And after Ali finally gets his chance, the descendants of Uthman, remember the rich guy, they decide that they have been done wrong by being ousted from the succession by Ali. So they come back in. They are responsible, according to some historians, for the assassination of Ali, and they take back over. They basically want, and they're not saying Uthman himself was necessarily very good at it, but they're saying that he was chosen and they are chosen, and so therefore they are the appropriate heirs. And they make that stick for about 90 years. They moved the capital away from Medina and Mecca, and you know, Medina and Mecca were the cities where the prophet actually lived, where Muhammad was as a live person. The descendants of Uthman, known as the Umayyads, moved the capital first to Damascus, and then when they kind of get overthrown in the Middle East, they are responsible for the origins of the Islamic Empire in Spain on the Iberian Peninsula. And so they go there once they get exiled from the Middle East, that the remnants wind up in Cordoba. So there's kind of this colony, if you will, up until they get thrown out of Spain in 1492. Does that make sense? What happens to them? They get about 90 years during, and that's the 90 years of conquest, of everything kind of goes their way for most of that time. And then in 750, another line of descendants who traced their lineage back to the uncle who raised Muhammad. Remember, after his mother and father die, he goes to live with his grandfather, and then when his grandfather dies, he goes to live with his uncle. The descendants of that uncle are the Abbasids, because the uncle his name was Abbas. And so they have about 700, not quite 800 years between then and the beginning of the Reformation and the modern era that they're in charge. They move the capital to Baghdad, actually in what was the territory of Persia. They're going to rule from there. And also Cairo, because they're going to become a presence on the Egyptian side of things too. And then in 1517, the Ottoman Empire will take over and conquer Constantinople, and that will be kind of the end of the business. Yes, Mike.
Where does the modern thing we hear on the news between the Sunni and Shiites, where does that show up historically in all this?
So the Shias are the party of Ali. They are the ones who felt like Ali should always have been the successor, that Muhammad named him his successor, and that he should have been in charge in the first place, and that the people who murdered him, who assassinated him, were the apostates, were not good Muslims. And so that they have always felt that the succession actually went to Ali's heirs. And there are different groups of them, right? There are different types of Shia Muslims. And some of them actually have numbers, like there are 12ers and there are 7ers. And those numbers come from how many descendants of Ali they trace before they give up about who ought to be the caliph, right?
So
who should have been caliph.
They're not in a physical group in a geographic area all through this time frame. They're scattered among the area, and they go in and out of popularity, or?
Well, they have communities. I mean, you cannot overestimate how tribal these communities are. So the tribes are the tribes who are of Ali's family. I mean, that's why they're called the party of Ali. They're the ones who are loyal to Ali, which means that, and it's a question, not even just of family, but of tribe. Your whole tribe is either pro-Ali or anti-Ali, basically. And so there are bubbles, I would say, of them. And they are more prominent and more powerful in certain areas. They come to power from time to time in certain areas. In fact, the Ayatollahs tend to be Shia. That's a Shiite term for a religious leader. And so in the long run, they become the conservatives. Immediately they're kind of the passionate and fundamentalist. I mean, one of the things that Ali, remember how corrupt Uthman was? He was a real nepotist. He assigned all his generals and all his governors and everybody were members of his family, right? there was a certain political expediency in that. Ali came to office because there was kind of nobody of that generation left. And so it's kind of like, okay, we got to turn this over to young folks now. And one of the first things he did was to kick out all of Uthman's relatives, kind of whether they were any good at it or not, because their appointments had been the product of nepotism and they were unrighteous. And so one of the things about Ali is he's righteous. You know, he wants to do everything by the book, and he wants to impose those punishments that were prescribed by the prophet. And he's a hardliner, let's put it that way. And I mean, so are his contemporary heirs. So it will become easy to be a Shia because it's always easier to be a hardliner when you're not in power. And you can be aggrieved and you can say, well, if we were in charge, we would have done this differently. Not only that, we would have done it the way Ali said, which is the way the prophet said, which is the way that God said, and things would be better if we were in charge, right? I mean, you can have that whole mindset for centuries and centuries. And that it is still that.
So for instance, you got Baghdad and Cairo as the head cheeses from 750 to 1517, but you might have bubbles or tribes of Shiite scattered through there in different areas under, they're putting up with the administration.
Well, and they're often resisting. I mean, you know, sometimes with military violence, sometimes with assassination, sometimes, I mean, you know, they were not unresourceful in terms of trying to assert their claims. Right. But the Umayyads and the Abbasids were political realists. You know, they knew who they had to make alliances with. They knew who they had to get along with. They knew how to try to keep this fairly fractious tribal community together enough to maintain a larger empire. Because the one thing they did not want was they did not want to go back to being a scattered, unstructured tribal culture that any other empire force could just kind of come along and walk over, because they had a historical memory of what that was like. They didn't want to do that again. Right. So the argument was always how best to achieve that, how best to not be torn apart, even though the conflict between the Sunni majority and the Shiite minority will be one of the vulnerabilities of Islam all the way along. I wanted to, before I forget, because we just did this really fun thing about Nowruz. Remember, we had the table with the 7 S's and the Persian celebration of spring and all that. I did not realize at the time what a political statement that was, because where is Nowruz from? Nowruz is from the Persian tradition. It's a holiday out of that religious tradition, out of Zoroastrianism, basically. And so once the Muslims took over in Persia, that was no longer a holiday, all right, as far as the Muslims were concerned. And so it sort of went underground. And then eventually, after the Ottoman Empire was dismantled and the Russian forces took over, the communist forces took over in Persia, which is now known as Iran, right? The communist government didn't want any holidays, right? They didn't want any religion. And so when the Shah came to power, one of the things that he did in Iran was to reinstitute the celebration of Nowruz. And that's where we really get the table of the 7 S's and all that. I mean, it's a fairly recent construction of the holiday. I mean, yes, it has roots that go way, way back, and there are pieces of it that you can find in old texts and stuff like that. And then when the Ayatollah took over, they banned it again, right? So that celebrating the holiday of Nowruz is a not just a cultural thing, it's a political thing. And I was kind of stunned when I realized what a statement we were making by saying, oh, look at these things
Sort
on
of
the
like
table.
Putin and the Russian Orthodox Church making a comeback now. And
Exactly, right.
Political, or are you just reestablishing your
Right.
religion?
Right. And it's a national identity thing too, that because we are Persian/Iranian, this is our cultural history. And so this is something that we do, which is why it's particularly meaningful to expatriate Iranians, that they do it as a way of staying connected with that sense of homeland, even though they might not be doing it in the homeland anymore because they're not allowed to, right? So anyway, I just thought that was a fascinating connection to something that, who knew? Okay, so though, yeah, go ahead, Anna.
Right. You were just, before you answered with Mike, you were going through the very bottom of the first page, and you went from Abbasid, if I'm saying it right, to
Abbasid,
Ottoman,
yeah.
to Ottoman in one sentence. And
Right.
I missed the connection to Ottoman. Can you just kind of do the Ottoman thing again?
No, because I haven't done it.
Okay, then I didn't miss it.
Right, no, you didn't. We're still in that pre-750. We haven't gotten to them really yet. I just wanted to show you how the structure worked out. And once we get to them, they are who we will have until Martin Luther's hammering his 95 Theses on the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral that same year as when the Ottomans come to power. So all the way through the Crusades and all the rest of that, it's going to be the Abbasids. So we'll get there, but I was not going to say a lot about them today, just to point out the way that the dates worked out. So I just want to show you some of the ways in which Christianity understood and responded to this thing that suddenly popped up out in the backyard where they weren't paying any attention, that is going to become a huge factor in the religious and cultural world that everybody is going to be living in. So in the very first instance, particularly the Byzantine military authorities and diplomatic leaders just saw this as one more tribal group on the Arabian Peninsula that they were going to need to deal with. And the way that they were used to dealing with that was by paying them off and flattering them. So that the tribal leaders apparently were very sensitive. And this was true with some of the European pagan communities, true. They were very sensitive to whether they were held in respect by the larger forces. So they would be like, yes, you are the Byzantine Empire, and yes, you can crush us like a bug, but we will serve you if you give us some shred of self-respect. And so when the Byzantines knew that they needed to make nice to one of the tribal communities, they would give them gifts, but they would also invite their leaders to sit in the councils of the leaders of the army or the leaders of the diplomatic group. And so it was partly flattery to the egos of the leadership of those tribal groups. And then the other thing they did was play them off against each other. And so it would be like, well, okay, this group is doing this for us. What are you going to do for us? And who's a better friend to, you know, the emperor of our outfit here. And so that was their initial approach to Islam. It's like, okay, here's another alliance among the tribes that we have to, you know, count into our diplomatic thinking here. But they did not take it seriously at all religiously. I mean, they didn't take it seriously pretty much, period. But they certainly didn't take it seriously as anything about having to do with religion per se. And then as the Muslim forces were successful, you know, as they turned many of these other tribes that the Byzantines were used to doing business with, suddenly turned out, oh, they're going to be Muslim too. You know, they're going to join that alliance rather than doing business with us anymore. It's like, okay, well, maybe we do need to think about what this is. And especially as they were victorious militarily, and that they were more victorious, they made more inroads with the Persians than they did with the Byzantines. And so this was, on the one hand, good news to the Byzantines. It's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, right? But they also realized that the alliances that they had with these tribal groups were kind of falling apart under the influence of Islam, and that areas that they were interested in were also being taken over, like Jerusalem and like Alexandria and like Antioch. And so their whole investment on that, the northern African crescent there along the Mediterranean, was not just threatened, but gone. And so they began to tell a story about that, which was that this was God's punishment for the disunity of the Christian church, right? So part of their communication to the Western Roman Church was, look what you guys have done to us, right? Because of our inability to get along, because of our entertainment of heresy, because you guys can't get your act together, God is punishing us with this visitation of these crazy Arabians, right? This new emergent threat from our southern border. And so this should sound a little reminiscent. Yeah, Peggy.
Well, I'm just wondering exactly when this is happening, if this has got anything to do with iconoclasm and the iconoclastic controversy, because I could see them pulling that in and saying, because they were arguing, we're in troubles, we got to stop making these images.
Right. That's another way in which the church is not flying right.
Right.
You know, and so therefore God is punishing them with this the creation of this enemy. But of course, it's all part of God's plan. And so what I'm hoping this makes you think about is when Israel is being beset, whether it's by Assyria or Egypt or Persia in their day, and the prophets are saying, you know, this doesn't mean that our God is weak. It doesn't mean that he has abandoned us. It means that he's pissed because we're not doing it right. And therefore he's creating this. And all we have to do to get rid of it is to do better, right? And so for the Christian church at that point, the thing that it seemed like they were doing wrong was the division, right, between the Western Christians and the Byzantine Christians. And so we need to put on our theological thinking caps and straighten out the things that we disagree about so that we can get back together. And the idea of images is one. Yes. What is it legitimate to have an image of? And of course, the Muslims have a very clear answer to that question, right? So it wasn't just a question within the Christian tradition, which I think is something people don't always recognize, that it's part of the cultural tension, if you will. But of course, it's all part of God's plan, right? And so there is no question that the Christian God is in charge of this and is making this happen. Right? Over time, as this becomes not just something that's happening, but a new state of affairs, that we have to live with what this reality now, they kind of shift that interpretation. And it's interesting because this is happening at the same point where the church has given up on Jesus's imminent return, right? We are now 500 years, 600 years past when Jesus actually lived. So, and not only that, but the Roman Empire is now on our side. You can't really see, when you look at Revelation and you say, all right, who is the beast with the 7 horns and who is the whore and who are all these figures? Once upon a time, that was Rome, right? Because Rome was what was threatening the Christian church. Rome is no longer the threat. Rome is the thing we're trying to protect. Well, here's the new threat, right? Here's the thing that, Revelation must really be talking about this. We just didn't know it at the time. Right. And so the whore of Babylon, right? It fits right in. Of course, they were talking about this. So there's now this sense, and I think it's a little bit like what you can see in the Christian fundamentalists now about how we need to protect Israel because, certain things have to happen in Israel before the end times can be here and Jesus can come back. And so there was this sense, it was not about protecting it, but it was like, now we realize that in order to prepare for the second coming, what we need to do is go conquer these infidels. That this is the challenge that is set before us in order to kind of make it possible for the end times to unfold. But still, of course, this is all God's plan. This is all part of what was predicted, right, by the prophets. This was all intended all along. So don't worry, God is still in charge. And that is going to be largely the attitude among the Crusaders, that this is the big adventure that God has called us to go on. We're going to get our sins forgiven. We're going to take back the Holy Land from the infidels, and then Jesus will come. It's all part of one big adventure. When that doesn't work out, and the caliphates start to be part of the political landscape that isn't going to change, both in Spain and in the former territories of Persia, and they become not just militarily successful, but also politically and economically and intellectually respectable. That these are places that, they've got better mathematics than we do. They've got better medicine than we do. They've got better trade routes than we do. We have to take them seriously. These are not just a fly on the wall kind of group. Then the Christians start to say, well, who are these people? All right, what does it say in the Quran? They start to translate it. They start to take the intellectual theological challenge of Islam seriously, and at the same time they start to see it not as something that God intends and is using, but as an actual threat to their vision of the divine divine. This is now the work of the devil. It's now something that is unholy, and it's somehow a barrier to our commission, you know, to go spread Christianity and baptize everywhere. This is now something that the forces of evil are putting up a roadblock to our doing that. And therefore we have to understand it better in order to be able to do something about it, so that we can fulfill our destiny here on earth as Christians, which is a little different from preparing the ground for the second coming, if that makes sense. So all of those, and the emergence of one of those ideas doesn't necessarily mean that the others go away. So they're kind of always all in the mix, but they emerge in sort of that order. So I know we're a little past time, but let me see if there are any questions or, but it's a lot to take in, but I kind of wanted to get that done so that we can move on to the Crusades and talk about those when I get back from my own adventure. Okay, everybody good until next time. See you in a couple of weeks. I'll send some notes.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
All right.
Thank
Have a
you.
good vacation. Bye-bye.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.